Good afternoon, everyone. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, whose customs and cultures have nurtured this land since time immemorial, and who will continue to nurture forevermore. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This land is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land. Assalamu alaikum to the Arabic speakers in the room. I'm so honored to be here this afternoon. I'm Sara Saleh, and I'll be your MC/curator for the afternoon. I would also like to introduce the panelists. We've got Aya Chebbi from Tunisia. Dr. Randa Abdel-Fattah. And Ruby Hamad. Thank you. So, I decided that I'm going to call this the anti-panel, or the un-panel. Why? Because I think that today we need to commit to unknowing and unlearning. What does that mean? It means that we want to decolonize some of the language that has been used around Arab women. We want to overturn some of the dominant and harmful narratives and the frames of reference. To give an example, often in interviews, what ends up happening, and the first very predictable question that we get is, can you be an Arab and a feminist? Can they coexist? No, they don't ask it like that, but you know, basically, is the statement Islam and feminism an oxymoron as well? And I do believe that Dr. Randa Abdel-Fattah, you had a lot to say about that.
Oh yes, that was on our, well, it's happened many times, and the most problematic part of being asked that question is it immediately frames the conversation as a problem in itself, and it immediately deprives you of the agency of defining feminism and defining Arabness and Muslimness on your own terms. So it presumes that any answer that you have is going to be considered with suspicion because it's already rendered something suspect and something oxymoronic. And it also assumes that there's one definition of feminism and one way of being Arab and one way of being Muslim. And so you can imagine when you're in an interview and there are so many layers of misunderstanding that you need to unpack in the first question, and they want a soundbite. And so it's basically a train wreck from the beginning.
Is there a power disparity there that presupposes, you know, enlightenment and rationality and secularism on one end versus you having, you know, the onus on proof being on you to live up to that one standard?
Well, absolutely, it is a power dynamic, and if I could, like, to sort of give people a sense of how dehumanizing it is to be approached in a way that immediately assumes that your answer is problematic. It's as though you're conducting an interview with a man, and he says, so tell me, can you be a woman and can you be intelligent? So you can see there that you are set up from the beginning. So when someone says to you, can you be a Muslim woman and a feminist? It's immediately showing their assumptions about you. And so you're put off on the back foot from the beginning.
I see you shaking your head, Ruby,
Yeah.
so I take it you disagree. You agree.
No, I think
Yeah.
Randa covered all of that. It's
And I would like to know, we were having this conversation around what it is to be an Arab, and it might seem like a basic term, but I feel like maybe you also had some important things to say about how we measure that and define that and what it means.
yeah, that's actually something that's really been preoccupying me a lot lately in what even is an Arab. First of all, we need to establish that Arab and Muslim are not synonymous, and Arab and conservatism are not synonymous. But even this term Arab, which is it is a very homogenizing term for what is such a hugely diverse area, you know, in terms of the cultures, even the dialects. So it's not a race. There is no a race of Arab in our world today, and so we've kind of defined it in terms of, well, it's a cultural and a lingual, you know, it's the language. But even in terms of Arab cultures and languages, like there's, you know, how many different, you know, if I were to sit and speak to, you know, me speaking a Lebanese dialect, okay. But if I were to speak to someone from the Gulf states, I can't understand what they're saying. I can recognize that it's Arabic and I can recognize some of the words, but I couldn't carry a conversation. And so the idea of that there is an Arab that is kind of the same anywhere, you'll find people that speak Arabic and have some similarity in their culture. That in itself is really something we need to break down.
The all-consuming, all-ever-present Arab.
Yeah.
And I presume that would transcend the constructs of country, of border and boundary, I suppose.
Absolutely. And the other thing I don't want to miss is how when we talk about the Arab world, we're actually talking about a geographical area that has many peoples that don't identify as Arab. So they're being erased as well. Yeah. And so that is something we have to keep in mind.
You mentioned Arab is not a race, but I think you've written something about how it's racialized.
Absolutely.
So what does that mean?
Well, there's an idea, a representation of what an Arab is, and everyone who is from that part of the world, including, as I just said, whether they identify as Arab or not, becomes that representation, that image that has been constructed, of the. If you're a woman, it's the oppressed, the silent, the victim who needs people to speak for her or to save her. And if it's the man, well then that's the oppressor, the threat.
I'm glad you brought that up. So we're talking victim or harem, and there's not much room left in between. So some of the other sort of labels that you often hear is and Saba Mahmoud, who's quite a prominent scholar, will say, liberal or moderate or orthodox Islam versus conservative Islam, as using these distinctions to highlight that sort of imported Western frameworks and how they often reduce the Arab world to dichotomies. And this stands truest when Western governments, we know, back secular dictators and despots. So would you agree with this sort of reduction? Is it problematic? What are the issues?
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe continue on what an Arab means. But I want to first say happy Women's History Month, happy International Women's Day. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you for having me on a special panel that you curated. And I think it's also a privilege to travel from the region I come from, where a lot of stateless people are, and free movement is not a right. So flying all the way here has been really a privilege. On Arab, I think for me, it's my daily controversial question, because people want to box. I come from Tunisia. It's in North Africa. And people try to box me somehow, like, are you part of the Middle East? Are you part of Africa? Are you part of the Euromed region, the Mediterranean? And whether it's in the scholarship, in education, whether it's in the UN system, whatever it is, this North African is confusing, And for me, it's very important to identify myself the way I want, or the way I articulate it, because on the Arab, dictatorship and support of that, for example, it's been propagated the Arab Spring, or the Arab Awakening, the Jasmine Revolution, and all of these are Western narratives. We have never been asked, what do we call our movement? And we call it the Revolution of Dignity. But also Arab is problematic because I identify as Afro-Arab. I have an African identity. I have a Amazigh identity. Amazigh are the indigenous people of North Africa, and the language we speak is Afro-Asian language. And other layers, I'm Maghrebian, which is, the Maghreb is these neighbor countries that share similar cuisine. We don't eat hummus and falafel, we eat couscous. Yeah. So when people assume, like, oh, you have shawarma and hummus, like, no, we have couscous. And we share our wedding tradition, all of that. But I'm also an Arabized Arab, because Arabs conquered North Africa, and we have been Arabized and Islamized. So I have a very complex identity that I am embracing, and I feel its richness. You know, when people see it as like it's difficult and we have to box you, I feel so blessed to be able to speak so many languages and navigate so many cultures and emerge in so many things. I think it's amazing, and we just have to embrace it.
I think also when we talk about identities, I think identity, like the conversation, it can split. And I think the issue for many of us who are in this sort of anti-racism space is not how do you define yourself, how do you express your identity or explore it. They're actually quite personal questions. They're quite personal navigations and journeys that shift and change. The more important question I feel, which has a lot higher stakes, is what does an identity do? How are you going to deploy and use my identity? What is the purpose of certain identifications having certain capital and others being used against you? How can you weaponize identity? And this is really what we are really immersed in, is how Arab identity is used to shut you down, to silence you, how it is used to save you, to civilize you, how it is used to bomb you, to occupy you. And I think those are the questions that are often sidelined in favor of more warm and fuzzy questions about what does being Arab mean to you, because generally in the political space people don't really give a shit what it means to you. What they want to know is how can we further oppress you because of your identity.
Yeah. On that note, I mean, feel free to clap. Let me go to the next question then, perfectly, because I always wanted to come to the Opera House and just drop a little Lila Abou-Lughod on you. Lila is a prominent Arab scholar, and she would say that, you know, we use women to justify everything from border control and immigration to wars and invasion. This suits our liberal fantasy of Muslim and Arab women who have no freedom of choice. But do we in the West have unlimited freedom to choose when choice is constantly debated and balanced with the public good across most, if not all, issues? So do you think these loaded concepts of choice are really only applied to Arab women, and does it deny them agency? And where does power play into all of this as well? Just a light question.
Definitely, yeah. This quote reminds me of Nawal Saadawi quote, when she said in Egypt, I think she was speaking somewhere in Europe, and she said in Egypt, they physically, they do female genital mutilation, they physically take the part in the clitoris. But here, women, even if they have the clitoris, they're banned and they're removed by Freudian theory and mainstream culture. So I think, for me, that's why I subscribe to feminism. I think feminism, maybe with an S as well, because it's a lot of ways of seeing feminisms. But it's about gender equality and equal rights and equal opportunity, but for me, the ultimate of it is about freedom. It's about who I am every day, however I speak, whatever I wear, my freedom of choice. And I have lived 1 year in London and 1 year in the US, and I have had similar challenges of how I think or how am I supposed to behave or what to wear in different contexts. I think women freedom or liberation is a universal challenge, but we need to recognize that we have the right to define that in our context and to deal with it, with our own tactics. To the identity politics question, for example, in Tunisia, we had, after the revolution, when we were writing the constitution, feminine movement came to Tunisia, and it was a huge failure because it came with the perception that first it's Arab women against Islam, and so we are here, Arab women by definition are submissive and oppressed, and we're here to protect them. But also it pushed for identity politics, which the conservatives themselves do. So they justify everything around religion and culture. But at that historic moment in Tunisia, we were trying to move from identity politics and focus on women issue as a political, social issue. Focus on how we're going to write the constitution, have women in, running for office, economic rights. So when you start putting another context into your own context, then you might not be on our team. You might actually screw what we were trying to do. So I feel there are, like, patriarchal system is universal, and there are different ways patriarchal system manifests, but we need to respect people's way of defining their own struggles and how they deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, he looks expectantly at me. Sort of what came to my mind there is that we're starting with a definition that whatever the West defines freedom as being, or feminism as being, or choice as being, is the definition that everyone has to go by. And one thing we don't really talk about so much is that even in the West, that definition has changed. So for a long time, as it was come up in the research of my book, the definition of a woman, a virtuous woman who was living her life in the best way, is someone who was very chaste and covered herself up and didn't keep company around men that she didn't know or were related to. And that was the measure, that was the standard that all, and that was the Western woman, the white woman, and that was the standard that all other women were measured against and found lacking. And I mean, if I say those words now, these are words that we would now more associate with supposedly, you know, with Arab women or with Muslim women. So there's been this kind of switch at some point when the West, because of, you know, feminism and the, you know, the countercultural movement, where they sort of thought, no, I'm going to shed these clothes and I'll wear what I want and I will be in control of my body and I'll be in control of my sexuality. And suddenly, this is what freedom means, this is what feminism means, and now anyone who isn't like this, they're the ones that have to change.
Yeah. So on that note, and very quickly, who informs your dynamic feminisms? I'd be interested to know.
Wow. So I mean, I pull it from everywhere, not even always necessarily from, explicit, feminists, but in terms of what I've been reading a lot lately is, Leila Ahmed and Randa Abdel-Fattah, who you quoted as well, in terms of getting into the some of the probably the key Arab feminists and academics. But I pull it from the music world, and I was saying this to you earlier, Sarah, like some of the Arab hip-hop, in particular Palestinian hip-hop, I find, and the way they use the music and their lyrics, and they have this really complete approach, and I don't want to use the word intersectional, it's just often overused, but they have this complete approach where they're not just singing about gender oppression, and as if everything can be framed through that. And anti-imperialism is a huge theme, with Shadia Mansour in particular, and she's a Palestinian rapper, and so they flip between that really easily. And there's a Palestinian hip hop group, Palestinian Israeli, so they're in Israel, rather not the occupied territories, DAM or DAM, and so they're mostly male. They have got a female singer that they brought on three years ago, May Sador, but even before that, they would collaborate with female singers and with female filmmakers to make their videos, and so they would make songs about the way in which women, Palestinian women, were treated, and how they were the occupation would be used as an excuse to further oppress and deny Palestinian women their rights. But then they're also singing about the occupation and terrorism, and they've got these great lyrics. Who's a terrorist? You're calling, I'm a terrorist. How am I a terrorist? I'm sitting in my country. I was just sitting in my country, and now you're calling me a terrorist. And then, a couple of years later, they're releasing a song with May Sador about where she's singing about how she feels this burden of she has to carry the shame and the honour of the family, and she's treated like, she says, I'm everything, I'm nothing, but tell me, who are you? So she's singing that to a man. So they have no problem in, and a lot of the academics and also Nawala Sadawi and Leila Ahmed, they turn, their critical eye just as much to their own culture and their politics and to the Western world. And I think that's something that is really lacking in how the West approaches lots of things, and particularly the Arab world, this idea that it's all one or the other. Everyone is either just blaming everything on this inferior culture, or else everything is just Western imperialism and...
The only good Arab is an un-Arab.
Yeah.
Before I answer the question about sort of who inspires me, you mentioned, Ruby, looking at sort of the West's definition of what is a virtuous woman, what is a woman, and it's sort of its counterpoint was the brown and black woman. And that's, I think, something that's been very much missing in conversations around feminism, particularly in a Western framework, and this idea that our insistence that we speak about feminism within a framework that brings in race, and that is because we have to deal with the history of how femininity has been constructed. And so if you look at, for example, the time of the African slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, so and Victorian era, so you had very high sort of ideals, Victorian ideals about chaste, Victorian women, who their place was the home. There was sort of the gatekeepers of morality, but that was the construction of the ideal female on the apex of the hierarchy. But men were allowed to rape and violate their black slaves because they were considered less than human. You had Lord Cromer, who founded and was the president of the League Against Women's Suffrage in England, but going to Egypt and lecturing Egyptians as the imperial lord about the way that they treated women. So he was this feminist crusader in Egypt, and yet he was against women's suffrage in London because, and that's not hypocrisy. That was because a fundamental different definition of who a woman is, and black and brown women was subhuman. And so when we in 2019 insist on a conversation, a feminist conversation that brings in race, not something that as a buzzword or something that's a footnote, but that actually deals with the fact that the white woman has been considered and defined as the universal moral subject for all time. That's where our rage comes from, because if you cannot address that, then all the other oppressions will not be addressed.
Randa's just made my book completely obsolete, by the way. That's literally what my book's about.
I'm so excited about your book because it's missing in the conversation.
Yeah,
we use domesticity and other spaces to subvert in a competitive, hyper-masculine capitalist system. So how do women navigate, in your worlds, respective worlds, navigate feminism in space? I'm interested to know how much that is gendered and how much do we use them to subvert and to own in our respective activist spaces.
Yeah, I was just actually wanted to continue from the conversation.
Go ahead.
Yeah, where to start? You just mentioned something really important. I think just growing up, I mean, today I find a lot of inspiration, I think also because of social media and people putting their full truth out there. But when I was growing up, it's really hard to find like your ideal or your superwoman to look at. And so I was inspired by Elisa, or Lebanese call it Alisar, the woman, because I was trying to find how can I be radical in a very conservative family? Both my father and mother's family are very conservative. And
in what way? Religiously, politically? I mean, these are sort of the, these are sort of the terms that I think we need to also unpack and explain. Yeah. And I think that's why I mentioned orthodox, for example, because there are some very political, deliberately political impositions or frameworks that really don't work in these types of contexts, I suppose.
Very religiously conservative, meaning I was the only non-veiled in the family, for example, or the only woman who doesn't treat marriage as an achievement, and and like left my parents' house and went to live by myself, or dropped school for 1 year and went to travel and things like that. So in the way our extensive family, it's seen as radical. But growing up, I cannot see a radical action or something. I didn't even think that would be radical. So when I read about Elisa, rebellion against her brother and coming to Tunisia to build Carthage, she's the founder and queen of Carthage, but also in a female leadership with her femininity. She wasn't trying to masculinize to be a queen or to build a whole empire around the Mediterranean. But I think after that, so growing up and arriving to a point where my rebellious in the family and around my society with the revolution became a political voice. So many people, when they ask, okay, how all these women were on the front line suddenly, in the region with the revolution, it's, women have been struggling for decades.
It wasn't just suddenly.
No, it wasn't.
Out of nowhere.
So we had a mini revolution in 2006, and there have been a movement underground of women, struggling and a build up to that exposure phase where enough is enough. But because also history makes women disappear, like you can't read about, like in the feminist movement in Tunisia, we are perceived as one of the most progressive countries in the region. But even in 1956, when we had very progressive rights like abolishing polygamy, giving women passport, giving their nationality to their kids, things that didn't exist in Africa and the Middle East at the time, it was credited to the Bourguiba, who was, the feminist statesman, It wasn't credited to the feminist movement that fought for the liberation and, made sure those rights are there. So just to say that also, like, as young feminists growing up, we do not have these figures in our history. We cannot read these kind of stories. And I think now growing up and reading, for example, hearing during the revolution and encountering all of the things that happen as well, in Egypt, virginity test and harassment and all of the things that you have to endure once you decide to step into activism, and like say, I'm a proudly feminist and this is what it means, and to resist every day, police brutality, all the stuff. So reading Nawal Saadawi, for example, saying, when she was depicted as a dangerous, savage woman, and she said, well, I'm saying the truth, and the truth is dangerous and savage, So seeing women like this to say, I'm like, yeah, hell yeah, I can also, it's possible that I can be a radical feminist, and that does not mean I'm extremist or whatever. That means it's my full badass self every day on the street, Like it's me fighting for my rights and fighting for what is right with my heels and with my, whatever I see.
Eyebrows.
Yeah, and yeah. And also, I wear, this is just a funny story, I have a curly hair. I came with last night. Today I felt like wrapping it. But I had my natural hair only for the last 8 years because also of this idea that the standards of beauty is a straight hair. And when I arrived to college, and this is one of the things, small thing like this, I struggle in my family because they think my hair is messy. And every time my grandma sees me, she's like, fix your hair. It's because of this notion that that is the standard of beauty. And so when I went to college and didn't find money or time to straighten my hair, I just went off the shower and my hair was curly. And I'm like, what? And since then, I've been just, wearing my curly hair. So also seeing women on the front line, because women who are always protesting on the front line, all these pictures, they're also perceived as angry and like not taking care of themselves or whatever. But also like breaking all of this and seeing all these women who inspire me today are all the young women I stand up with next to, on the protest, because they're just there with their full potential and their full ideals of what our life should be, and they're just accepted that way.
I'm glad that you mentioned, obviously, that the reality is that in a lot of these contexts, feminists are denied, and erased at best or at worst. And I'm wondering if there's something to be said about the role of privilege in some of the examples that you've mentioned. So, for example, when we talk about what women are subjected to in terms of in Egypt or in Tunisia in the protests, police brutality or the virginity tests. I'm wondering, where does class and race also play into these sort of these abuses? Like it's not just gendered, is it? There's definitely an interplay of these factors. So I'm wondering if you can unpack that a little bit more, because privilege protects.
Of course, no, absolutely. I mean, if you look at Tunisia, for example, as I said, we have our indigenous people, Amazigh, and Amazigh have been part of the struggle and part of being on the front line of the revolution. But then after, when we wrote the constitution, we still don't have Amazigh as an official language. It's official language in Algeria and Morocco. And it's, I mean, basic indigenous right is language, but also the Nubian rights in Egypt, and there have been sidelines after the revolution. It's the same, you know, it's a layer. So you're a female, you're indigenous, and you're this and this and that. And you, now when you are all together against the dictatorship, yeah, we're great, you know, and we're all on the front line, but then after we all win, you're then, you're then sidelined around the issue. But I think also class is very important, because Tunisia has also this, which I find it really problematic, this francophone related to class, because we are post-colonial countries, and we're left with a lot of inherited colonial systems that divided us along these terms, you know, class and color and all of the layers. And being francophone today in Tunisia, you can find better job because you speak French. It's related to class. And I think why people ask a lot of times why Tunisia's revolution succeeded, I think because it was working class revolution. It didn't stop at the middle class. It started with the youth, yes, and you know, intellectual joined, artists joined, but then the labor union joined. And when the labor union mobilized people with all the different class and all the different layers of their marginality, and also we don't forget that Tunisia started from a central city with the most marginalized region in Tunisia. So that made, that is one of the factors why it went on to the end. When I compare it, sometimes question we all ask, what happened in Egypt? And I feel it was still a middle class revolution, because it was just the same class speaking to each other. And of course, the revolution happened with 10% of the population, but still, it wasn't working class revolution. And so you still feel the voice of the most marginalized was not heard. So now when we're writing a constitution and when we're thinking about democratic transition, it doesn't really matter to me, because I can't put 3 meals a day on the table. You know, I wasn't involved in that. So don't ask me now of what a constitution should look like, you know?
Yeah, I think that so often that when we talk about rights and liberation, we forget it's the material conditions of people's lives that if the feminist project is not going to address materiality and how that affects people's day-to-day lives, it doesn't matter how many pronouns you change, if it's not going to address the inequalities, the economic and financial inequalities, then you're not going to the root of the problem. There was something that you said, Aya, that I wanted to talk about because it really resonated. It's sort of the erasure of women from history. And this is something I feel so passionate about, because I think that we need, when we think about the sort of the nexus between the connection between power and knowledge, and how ignorant, wholesale ignorant we are about the women's agency in the Middle East, you know, how ignorant we are about the role of women in these liberation movements, you know, the education systems, the way that we teach our children, you know, from my point of view, in a Western framework, about history. We are building that next generation of lawmakers, of change makers, and that is why it's such an impoverished conversation, and that's why we're not addressing these sorts of issues. I mean, something as simple as my daughter's year 8 history humanities class, and she's at an Islamic school as well. And you know, most teachers, I come from a family of teachers, so I know how time poor and how you know, immersed they are in all the paperwork. So it's very difficult to decolonize a curriculum. It's very difficult to go out and do the hard work of rewriting a history curriculum. And that's why we need systemic change, because our next generation of students, our current generation of students, are just learning about Europe. They are just learning about white feminist heroines. We are not actually rebooting the system, and that's why we don't get to hear about people like Aya. We don't get to hear about what's happening in the Middle East and across the world, the global north, because it is such a Eurocentric education system.
So decolonizing the institutions is a place to start to continue this conversation, I suppose. And I want to go back to something that also Aya touched upon, and I think it's important, obviously, to say that the different countries across the Arab world each have a very different relationship internally between government and religion, and government and church as an institution. So, you know, within the post-colonial hangover that they continue to exist in. So the way that tiny Lebanon might accommodate 18, 19 different sects in its, you know, very small geographical location, it will be different to the way that Tunisia does, or Egypt might, or the Gulf countries that you mentioned earlier. So I mean, I don't presume that you're going to be able to address this all in the next 2 minutes, or even do the, you know, the question justice, but I would like your thoughts on what should, you know, what does that interaction look like to you, or what should it look like in your specific country or thematic experience, so we can narrow it down a little and maybe provide a little nuance. Oh, so that was a mouthful. Did anybody follow that question? I forgot what I asked.
You're asking what, depending on the country we're talking about.
Yeah, and to your experience.
What is the relation between sort of religion and government?
Yeah. Often it's,
or how is it managed?
Yeah, often it's you know, bad or good, and there's no room for, you know, conversation in between that, the grey. And what I would really like is the grey, because I think, you know, there's obviously a lot of conversation, and minorities would also be something that comes up, and I'm interested to see what that looks like to you.
I actually learned something very recently, very interesting about Lebanon. So that's where my dad's side of my family from, and where we kind of mostly say we're Lebanese just because of, you know, the Arab way of passing nationality on down through the father. My mum is Syrian, so you know, in Lebanon, so they have, as you said, 18 different sects, but we'll keep it simple. So the Sunni Muslim, the Shia Muslim, and the Christian Maronite. So they have a system where forgive me if I get this wrong, the president has to be Christian, the prime minister Sunni, and the speaker, the
head of
Shia.
parliament.
The head of parliament is Shia. So that's just how they manage the
divided it, yeah.
And so it's how they manage the sort of the sectarian issue there. So, and part of what I learned is, you know, there is 450,000 Palestinian refugees in camps, and they're not naturalised. They won't be naturalised. They will not be given citizenship. And I was listening to a talk by an academic, and so she was talking about Lebanese literature. So what she has found, that even amongst across all sects, if you talk about the Palestinian, like why won't they be naturalised? They'll all agree we should not give them naturalisation because they're going to disrupt sort of the sectarian balance that we've got, and we don't want another war type thing. And I asked, well, would that be the case as well for Sunni? Because most Palestinians are Sunni. Wouldn't they, you know, would not naturalisation kind of be in their favour in that sense, if we're, you know, being really basic here? And she said, well, the issue is that Palestinians tend to be very left. They're more left than the most of the Sunni population in Lebanon. It means economically. So the Sunnis, politicians are quite neoliberal, and so that is actually part of the underlying fear. So we tend to, and I made that mistake myself, I kind of looked at it through this one frame of, oh, it's all about sectarianism, and the Sunni will be with the Sunni and the Shia, and she's like, you know, saying no, like there's economic issues at hand, like they're much more left-wing, generally speaking, and that is one of the key issues of why they won't be naturalized, because it's going to like sort of the fear of that is going to shake up Lebanon economically and politically, not religiously.
And it would also affect the right of return, which is obviously a very political issue as well
yes,
for Palestinians back there. And I think that's something that probably, plays a huge part. So I guess,
I just want to share Tunisia's experience. I think what I learned after the revolution, because we were living in a dictatorship for 23 years, and the Muslim Brotherhood in Tunisia were oppressed, exiled or jailed. We had a kind of, call it liberal dictatorship, because you were not supposed to wear veil, you were not supposed to have any sign of religion. We had like police university. If you have a beard, you need to shave. So it's a total opposite of what people think of like Tunisia, predominantly Muslim society. So after the revolution, then it was freedom for everyone, right? And we need to accept that means even politically organizing, Muslim Brotherhood can also exist on the political scene. And that made me learn two things about the left and the progressive side, is that they are exclusive and unorganized, because the Muslim Brotherhood, when they came, which they claim to be moderate, not because they want to, but I think because of Tunisia's history. It has a very strong history of progressivism. But they were so organized that, they won first election, they won the majority. They had, more women in the parliament than any other political party. They had women on top of the lists of their electoral lists. Very organized, while the left completely disorganized and completely disfragmented.
Can relate to that.
And then also the left was very exclusive. So many of the very progressive, again related to like class, francophone, long history of feminist-led civil society, were very exclusive of whoever would not look like them, And I think that's when we as young feminists, that clash, that we don't want to be exclusive, we want to be inclusive to everyone, and everyone, it's the Tunisia we want to build, and we want to build it with all its diversity. Everyone should play the game of democracy. So in the Constitution now, we have a very interesting debate about unequal inheritance, which a law we're discussing now in the parliament, and if it passes, it would be the first ever in the region to happen. And it's very interesting debate. And even in the Constituent Assembly, when we were writing the Constitution, it was exciting to build advocacy groups and talk every day to Islamists who think that we shouldn't put gender equality, and convince them why we should have equal, not complementary in the Constitution. We should have a dot, not a comma, so it's not interpreted this way. And it was a daily exercise, and many of them compromised, and that's why we ended up with compromise style of politics, and that's how we ended up with the most progressive constitution in the world.
So then, in our general Western mindset, it seems that it is difficult for us to imagine, a religiously devout woman or group living in a modern and, dare I say, maybe secular, if that's the choice, world. So, would you agree with that statement?
What was the first part?
So we find it difficult to imagine that level of complexity, that there might be religiously devout individuals, women, groups, organizing on that level, being involved front and center in politics, and living in a modern and maybe secular, if that's what we can describe Tunisia as, world. But is that the same here? Is that your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this it speaks to, I think, a very a lot of my research with people about their perceptions about Muslims. As I did my PhD was interviewing Islamophobes about what they found problematic about Islam, or people who were very ambivalent about multiculturalism. And one of the things that came out was in Australia in particular, and I think it speaks to most Western societies, there is a fundamental suspicion about religiosity. And in the Australian experience, anyone who is outwardly religious is it evokes the memory of Christians' experience with the Grand Inquisitor, Christianity's experience with puritanical Christianity, and that is superimposed on a Muslim history and experience because there's no recognition that the histories are very different. And so when people see someone who is outwardly religious, it immediately evokes that fear and that disdain for someone who wears religion on the outside. They're considered like Bible bashers. That's actually an Australian invented term. So in Australia, you have either dogmatically against religion, or you have something different, which we don't speak about, which is that it is not a society that is strictly separating church and state. We still read prayers in Parliament House. I mean, religion is still very much, Christianity is still very much part of our society. We have our religious holidays on Christian holidays, but it is very much a privatized idea of religion. And so a Muslim woman who wears the veil, a Muslim who fasts or prays, immediately disrupts that image of the privatized religious subject, and immediately it's looked upon as you are trying to take over, you're trying to push your religion on us. So that's one of the problems. And then the idea of choice. So we've moved on from debates around Muslim women have the right to veil. Now it's the idea, well, it's a false choice. You have a false sense of consciousness. You're making the wrong choice, so you don't know what's good for you. And I think that stems from a real lack of understanding of what choice means for Muslims, and how Muslim women and Muslim men, sort of reconcile religiosity and don't feel that there's any incompatibility between living a life of dignity and beauty and equality and fairness with their religion. And I think that it's because of all these sorts of things that are underneath these layers of history that people are imposing on a Muslim experience with religion.
Yep. Before we get to our last question, I just wanted to ask that if you can start making your way to the microphones as we get ready to take questions to the panelists. And where there are access limitations, we'll make sure that we bring the microphone to you, so just let the volunteers know. So we've got one microphone here, and the second one where number 2 is over there. So bring your questions, don't hold back, we're ready for you. My last question, I did want to talk a little bit about anti-blackness in Arab communities, and it's a very specific conversation because, of course, we know that often there comes a cost for women of color to speak out and speak out about issues that might be happening internally in our communities, because obviously that provides lots of fodder to the trolls and the alt-right and the racists. But I think it would be remiss of us not to talk about that. So perhaps some reflections on our role in propagating anti-blackness in Arab communities, be it here in Australia and obviously in Tunisia as well. And you touched upon Nubian rights, so maybe you might want to explain that as well in case people missed it.
Yeah. Well, in Tunisia, actually, just a few months ago, we also adopted a law criminalizing racism, which is the second in Africa after South Africa, after the fall of apartheid. But it's one thing to have the law, it's another thing to implement it and reinforce it, and it's another thing to change people's attitude and behavior and understanding of what that means. And it's also interesting, I mean, in North Africa, ourselves, because of education, because of political and economic division, as well as being, part of Africa and all of that, there is a lot of ignorance about our history. And of course, Black Tunisians are discriminated in the representation in the media, in the representation in the parliament. We have only one Black woman in the parliament. We had in December an Ivorian who was murdered, and we made a lot of advocacy around the issue. But I think as much as we need to push to protect, people who are, in general, people who are marginalized, but also particularly anti-Blackness, we need to just promote the idea of accepting the other who is different from you. Like in general, we just have this, idea of like the fear of the other who is different from you. Like everyone wants everyone to look like them and behave like them and speak like them. And I think it's also an insecurity of many Tunisians who are racist towards whether black Tunisians or, people who come from other African countries to study in Tunisia. It is an issue of accepting the other. And there is also an embedded culture growing up. I mean, even myself, I had to... there are things that you say as part of your culture, like we have words like usif, we say it for a black person, but the literal meaning slave. And we just grow up saying the word. And you, as a child, you just call each other like that, and the child accepts it, they don't think it's racist. You accept it, you don't think it's racist. And growing up, you have to unlearn all of that, and you start thinking about, in the context of people's rights. On the Nubians in Egypt, I think just part of people saying that many of the movements who started the revolution failed, and one of the things comes to Egypt all the time is failure of the movement. And one of the gains is Nubians' rights, because Nubians' rights have been finally in the constitution.
That's interesting that you say that, because often, elections, for example, are seen as a measure of progress in different countries around the world. I'm not naming any that have appeared in media in recent times, but it's interesting because that's literally this checkbox of elections. That's the reductive frame of reference, as though there isn't any cultural or social change happening on these different levels in various avenues. So it's really
I struggle with that. I struggle with international standards of ranking our countries based on how peaceful or violent our elections are, And I feel like the world have a very short memory of what happened in 2011, 2012, because we changed the course of history, damn. We did. We have completely changed the trajectory of what countries have gone through, starting from Tunisia to all the countries to Occupy movement around the world, to different regimes changing in Africa. And it's going unrecognized, and it's going overlooked of the agency of what happened. And particularly in Tunisia, we didn't have any civil society before the revolution. In 2 years, we built a civil society that saved the country from a crisis. We won the Nobel Peace Prize. People spend years to win the Nobel Peace Prize. We won the Peace Prize just because of 2 years of Tunisia coalition of civil society organizations coming together to save the country. Women in public space, women, sexual harassment in Egypt. Egypt came up with the term of sexual harassment in Arabic. We didn't even have a term to describe what sexual harassment is. Taharrush al-jinsi. So it's all these gains that we did. Turning social media into a tool for social change. No one would do that before. I would say proudly we Tunisians started. We literally started the first Facebook event to invite you not to a graduation party or wedding, but to a protest in the middle of Ministry of Interior. And that did not happen before, and that completely changed how we organize online in the digital space, the hip-hop, the scene, the creativity, the mobile application that came out after in addressing different issues. It all came of that generation of 2011 that came to the street to say, to change things. So I really struggle of all of this happening, and we're just looking at how elections or the turnout of people to election or how peaceful or violent it is, and we forget the whole struggle in between and what we achieve in between and the transition that we go through.
I might go to the microphone. Is there someone? Yep. Come on up. And we'll take a brief question, not comment, please.
Okay. We mentioned this earlier, but we talked about the presence of it, but I'd just like some detail on how we can actually address it. So how does one address individuals not from a particular ethnic background addressing issues that they may believe are present within that ethnic community? They might mean for the best, but it sometimes comes across as, let me tell you how you're oppressed. How do we have that conversation of, actually, that's not an issue, but this is? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah. I'd like to take that.
Do you want to? We encounter this a lot. So when it's sort of like speaking outside your own experience, speaking outside, I think it depends on when things are done in good faith. First of all, when it's done, people who have done the work, it will always be obvious. If people are invested in checking themselves, understanding an issue, speaking and listening, before they comment, I think that's very important. There's a lot of communities whose problems are co-opted by outsiders, either as sort of virtue signalling to say I'm so intersectional, but they actually don't do the work. And so this, for example, happens a lot. There's a lot of people who now use the buzzwords of intersectionality. I don't see them at, for example, Palestinian film festivals. Why aren't you coming and watching films by feminists from Palestine? If you're so into hearing about the other side, then come and support local initiatives where we are trying to be change makers in our local communities. Step up and be there in that space before you can speak, and never speak on our behalf, always from a position of never speak on other people's behalf. Yeah.
Thank you. Is there, yep, step up. Is there, I can't actually see if there's someone there, sorry. No. Okay, we'll take your question.
Have any of you ever felt that someone told you that you weren't Muslim enough or not Arab enough, and how did you overcome it?
Daily.
I didn't know.
Do you ever get told that you're not Muslim enough or Arab enough? Oh. Get told I'm not Australian enough.
Yeah. I'll take the Arab one, right? Because this is something that has come up very recently. Throughout my career, I've been writing for 10 years, and obviously before that in my personal life, go back to where you came from. You don't like it here, go back to Saudi Arabia, which once again speaks to this whole homogenization of the Middle East, because I have never been to Saudi Arabia. So I was always getting this, you don't really belong, and you can't critique and you can't criticize our country because you're doing it as an outsider, so go back. And very recently, since the racial dolezal transracial incident, they've kind of changed tactics, and I'm getting, oh well, what are you talking about? You're white. Look at you. You're not even like. Why do you call yourself Arab? Like, are you transracial? Do I have? Yeah. So it's just such a we were talking earlier about these questions that set up. They set you up to fail even just by trying to address or answer them, and. So, yes, I get it. And obviously, the Muslim issues is another issue altogether. But often it just comes from such a fundamentally dishonest place that it's not worth. You kind of have to try to laugh it off, or because it's just gaslighting. Really, they're just gaslighting you. But it's about what they can say to make you silent, and it doesn't matter that how I look in that moment to them, or whether my skin is dark enough to qualify as an Arab or as a brown person, has no bearing on how I've been treated and how my family's been treated and what it's like to move in the world as an Arab person. So it's just such a fundamentally dishonest question that
I think sometimes it's not even about whether you're Arab enough or Muslim enough, but it's about you actually Arab Muslim as in for the whole world or for the whole region, like it's the opposite.
So do you mean like the burden of representation?
Yeah, so like when I used to teach Arabic in the US, people would ask me about Saudi women and would ask me about Moroccan women and I'm like,
blanche, please answer for every single.
Yeah, and I'm like, like we are, 22 Arabic-speaking countries and like, millions of people around the world who identify as Arab Muslims. So there is also the other burden, which is like, I don't represent a homogeneous group. I have a lot of identity and within myself already to deal with.
Putting aside, the whiteness and the what that means when you pass as white and that privilege, I do think that it is probably a very colonial question that fundamentally tries to silence and divide, doesn't it? It's that inheritance. But on that note, perhaps what we can say is that our identities are not fractured. They work as overlays. I don't know. You don't have to agree with me, but it is, 10 seconds into the end of the panel, so I guess I get to have the last say.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Please thank our panelists as well.